Behind the scenes.
Yes, here we go. Hey everyone, it's Zohran. Today we have Yadira Dume and Joanna Manch. They're organizers here in Astoria and the founders of the Astoria Tenants. The Astoria Tenants Union was very recently set up. And so Yadira, can you talk about why there was a need to get started with an organization like this?
Yes. Hi everyone. Hola a todos. Thank you for giving us the space to talk about Astoria Tenant Union. As you mentioned, it's relative new. We started like right before the outbreak. So it has been challenging, but you know, we form Astoria Tenant Union. I mean, despite the fact that we're very passionate about the issue, we know, and I think you already know, it's just like how out of all the housing in Astoria, 30% it's rent stabilized. And nearly, or like many of those rent stabilized, many of the rent stabilized units have been deregulated throughout decades, and that's alarming, right? So that tells you that we now have more market rate units, and as you all know, nearly half of Astoria tenants are rent burdened. That means like that they're paying 30% of their income on rent, and a quarter of them are paying more than 50% of their income on rent, and that those numbers are alarming, right? So we want to make sure that we want to preserve those 23% rent stabilized units, and then we also want to pass good cause eviction for those unregulated tenants to have some sort of protections. But here we are in the midst of a pandemic, and it's kind of challenging, but I think there is still a need for tenant organizing despite the circumstances.
Absolutely. And you know, Joanna, I wanted to ask you, what have you been hearing from local tenants? You know, when Yadira is talking about organizing in the midst of this pandemic, what have you been hearing from local tenants about how the COVID-19 crisis is impacting their housing security?
Yeah, so in particular, like in my building, I have lived in Astoria my whole life. I live in a 6-unit rent stabilized building. 5 of those apartments house long-term tenants, and 1 recently moved in young family. Most of the people have lived here their whole lives and are work domestic service jobs, which, as we know, you cannot do from home, right? My mom is a housekeeper. She can't do that from home. And we are a building of immigrant families, just as a lot of Astoria is. And from talking to some of my neighbors, there is this whole mentality of we'll make it work, right? But that shouldn't be the case, right? Especially when there's a government willing to bail out the financial sector, but not working class tenants like my neighbors and myself. So this is something that we're continuing to see, and that's why Adira will speak further later on about how we want folks to give us more information about how the COVID-19 is specifically impacting them, because we want to be able to do the outreach, even if it is just digitally or through phone banking.
Absolutely. And you know, we've been trying to have as many conversations as possible about housing to get an understanding. You know, you have talked about, Yadira has talked about the kind of the percentages in terms of, you know, 24% of Astoria tenants paying half their income to rent, about 50% almost of Astoria tenants paying 30% of their income to rent. So it's clearly that this is a pre-existing crisis before this pandemic. And I had a conversation with Rima Begum of the Bangladeshi Tenants Union, and she was saying, you know, the way in which this pandemic has pushed people who were already in a precarious position to the brink. And that as a result of that, they are preparing for a rent strike. And I was wondering, Yadira, is there any discussion of that in Astoria?
Absolutely. Shout out to Rima, first of all, and then because she's really uplifting voices, those marginalized voices that we usually don't hear of. So she's doing an amazing job. And then I know she's doing some work in Jamaica, but we can also, that also resonates in Astoria. And I was able, through through Astoria Mutual Aid Network, I was able to hear people's concern about April 1st, and about like, oh, what, we are losing an income, and we're going to be able, and some were like, I'm not going to be able to pay rent. So what should I do? I mean, there's this notion of a rent strike. What does that mean? So I think that's when Joanna and I were talking about how can we organize digitally, that there is a need for tenant organizer during this pandemic. And we know that millions across the states won't be able to pay rent today, and then throughout the pandemic. And so we want to be able to be a resource to tenants in Astoria, because there isn't an organization that is organizing Astoria, and we wanna, as a tenant organizers, we wanna be able to help them out throughout the process, right? Because it's not easy. Some people don't know what does a rent strike looks like. So.
And in the interest of that very thing, Joanna, could you speak a bit about rent strikes in general, what they are, why they're so tough, and how they can actually be successful?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I know that there's a lot of talk about this citywide rent strike, and a lot of folks are like, is that even legal, right? And it's like, yeah, of course it's legal. As tenant organizers, it's always a tactic that we bring up to tenants when they're dealing with issues with their landlords, and they place their demands. And if their demands aren't being met, then they withhold rent, right? The issue, of course, always is that, like, for example, I live in a small building, right? And I know a lot of my neighbors, but folks can live in larger buildings, or are people that don't necessarily have contact with their neighbors. And there is a need to build that trust so that, like, a lot of folks participate in it, because it's only really successful when the majority, if not the whole building, participates in this rent strike. And so, but the beauty of it, of course, is that when you are able to hone in on that power of having the majority, if not your whole building, withholding rent, you really can see the shift of the power go from the landlord to the tenants, right? And that's really what we want to see, right? Especially if the demands aren't being met at a government level through Governor Cuomo, and our landlords, if we set a demand of like, oh, we are not going to pay rent, and they don't compromise, then those demands need to be met at any way, right? And that means withholding rent or by any means, right? And that solidarity needs to be there, which could be difficult, but it's beautiful if it does happen, because you do see the power that tenants can have when they work together and seek change.
Absolutely, and I think that it's such a necessary tool to understand and to implement in times like this, because right now, this situation has so many of us feeling so helpless, and people are left to feel like they're kind of at the behest of a pandemic, and then at whatever the whims are of the governor. And what I really appreciate about what the two of you do and what tenant organizers do in general is to remind people of their power. You know, I saw something earlier today of a landlord in Los Angeles who forgot to put all of his tenants on BCC, telling them that they still need to pay. And then they all had each other's emails. And so they started organizing on that thread about how to withhold rent. So, you know, Yadira, I wanted to ask you, Joanna had referenced it before, but how can people get involved with ATU if they're a tenant here in Astoria? How can they let you know what they're going through right now?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Joanna's point about what a rent strike looks like, and it's a collective action, right? It was through the surveys that we were able to put together last week, as we saw that more people were responding to our survey and then had questions about rent strike. It's just like one of them had said, or even like in Slack, they were like saying, they were asking, you know, many of my neighbors can't pay rent. I'm able to pay rent, but I think we, at this moment, we need to show solidarity. And if they can't pay rent, then I would whole rent,
Yeah.
and then we all are going to go in a rent strike. So we're just building a new base on our own and under these circumstances. But we were able to connect with, like I said before, with Astoria Mutual Aid Network and with your campaign as well. We're joining efforts, and then that's what community looks like, right? Even people that are not impacted by housing, or we are seeing that people just want to get involved. And then so we started with a survey, and then under everyone's capacity, right, we're gonna be able to plug them in somehow. I know that your campaign is working in the building block captains, and then they're gonna be doing like frequently trainings. Is amazing, right? So I think we have like a long-term goal in terms of like how can we all join efforts and make Astoria beautiful, and then people for Astoria residents to be more plugged in the community, right? Because this is just like one moment, but who knows what could happen next year. And we want to be prepared, and we want to show solidarity for those that are going through like a financial hardship or any kind.
Absolutely. And I think that, when we release this video, we're going to also, along with it, include the link so that people can fill out what their experience is and get in touch with you at ATU. And then the last question for both of you is, what got you into tenant organizing, and why do you feel it's an important terrain of struggle?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot sometimes. I think it's an interesting question because for me, it's not like an interest. Like it's very much so about survival and preservation of community. And as a lifelong New Yorker, that's something that we strive for and fight for, right? Because we have seen just how much displacement there's been in our neighborhoods, through small businesses, through people being displaced from their homes, from what we said in the beginning, like what Yadira said in the beginning about like seeing this dynamic of the deregulation of units. And usually those units were housed by low income folks, right? So for me, it's all about that, right? It's about the preservation of my community. And housing is really just the epicenter of a lot of people's existence, right? You need a house to be able to feel safe, secure, and be able to then do anything really, right? You need an address a lot of times for a lot of things, and security. So I think that's for me always been a driver. It's just like I know that housing is a human right, and everyone should that should be a basic right, and that's something that we should fight to preserve for folks.
Absolutely. And Yadira?
Yeah. I can start off by saying the housing is a human right. And then through my organizing years, even as an immigrant rights organizer, I was always witnessing the struggle of many of my communities struggling to pay rent. And so that was an issue that was very present to me. And and be able to also use this tool as to empower people, and that is a beautiful thing, being able to uplift those voices that haven't been heard, and giving them that power. It really is rewarding because they come from a vulnerable place to a place of power, right? That they know that there's existent matters, that they know that they have so many rights and that they need to fight for them. And so be able to use that tool, be able to see that they use those tools to empower themselves and then come together is what motivates me to keep organizing and it's just like a small details, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's very, it's very a very rewarding job.
Well, I wanted to thank both of you so much for taking the time to speak with us and for launching something as exciting as the Astoria Tenants Union. It's something that I think is much needed in our neighborhood. And frankly, what makes this neighborhood beautiful are the same communities, families that are at risk of being pushed out of this very neighborhood. And it's the work that the two of you do, and that the many people that will join you, that they will do, that will keep this neighborhood the one that we fell in love with all that time ago. So thank you both so much.